Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. My name is George, and I am the president of Chapter 415, Vietnam Veterans of America, Lehigh Valley. On behalf of our board of directors, every member of Chapter 415, and every associate member of Chapter 415, it is my pleasure and privilege to stand up here and welcome you to the first Agent Orange Town Hall meeting in the Lehigh Valley. Our main objective this afternoon is very simple. We'd like you to leave a more informed consumer and with a greater knowledge of Agent Orange than what you walked in here with. We have assembled a panel with great wisdom, field experience, and a passion for what they do. It is our tradition at Chapter 415 that we begin every event with an invocation, a pledge of allegiance, and a moment of silence for the POW MIAs. That being said, I'd like to bring up our chaplain, George Shumack, and yield a mic for his invocation.
Let us bow our heads. O Heavenly Father, we ask that you be present with us this day as we begin our town hall meeting regarding the effects of the dreaded disease Agent Orange. We ask that you open our hearts and minds to the information being presented today. And we also thank the many experts presenting these facts. We pray for the many veterans and lay people and their families that are suffering from this dreaded disease. We ask, O Lord, that you give them strength and comfort in their time of need. Most of all, precious Lord, we thank you for many blessings we receive every day from your bounty. In Jesus' name, amen.
Those that are able, please remain standing, and if you would join me in the Pledge of Allegiance. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. If we could remain standing for a moment of silence and remembrance for our POW MIAs from all wars. Thank you so much. Our moderator today will be Richard Hudzinski, Second Vice President, Chapter 415 Vietnam Veterans.
Good afternoon. The program that you were handed gives you the lay of the land and our speakers' biographies and the sequence of events that will occur in this attempt here to heighten your awareness and give you a way to contribute towards better research on the topics we're about to present. There are 5 commandments. First, be courteous. Please turn off your cell phones unless you're a doctor. Put it on Hummer. Remember that this is a public event, that we're going to be videoing it, and there will be some photography, but please keep your flashes down. Try not to use them. Do not piddle here. We have restrooms. We will take a break at 2:50, but if you need to go to a restroom, there are restrooms on the first floor. Just take the elevator on that side. There's one for men and women. And on the 3rd floor, there's another one for women and also those who require ADA compliance, handicapped. Remember, this is not a claims session. This is an educational session. If you have a personal claim that you want to file or a question about a claim, this is not the place. If as a result of this education that you receive here, you decide that you want to file a claim, we have actually arranged for people from the Department of Military and Veterans Affairs. They are accredited service officers to help guide you and start the process. They're out at the back here in that mobile van. Most of your claims, anyway, will end up with a county director of Veterans Affairs or a veteran service officer. But they'll help start you off on the process, explain what you need to do, and send you in the right direction. As this seminar proceeds, you will probably have some questions. We provide you in your package an orange card, all right? And at the end of each segment, we will have someone go up and down the aisles and collect them from you. If you need another card, we will issue that. Those cards will then be collected and organized during the break for consolidation, considering the time. And I will ask questions of the panel at that time. And last, on your agendas, you'll see a number here. It's part of a raffle for those quilts that were outside. When we re-adjourn after the 2:50 p.m. break, we'll announce the winners for that before we convene the panel. With that, let me start off with the first segment. That's Paul Sutton and Mike Eckstein, who will be talking about the issue of Agent Orange and how it all started. Paul.
Thank you. Nice to see some old familiar faces here. Brian, John, where'd Jeff go? There he is. I joined the United States Marine Corps Reserve on 17 September 1961. And for the last 54 years, my government has lied to me. I didn't know it at the time. I was just a young, stupid 17-year-old recruit who, at the completion of my senior year, went off to boot camp and what I thought was going to be a career in the Marine Corps. I was 20 when I made it to Vietnam. Had absolutely no idea that we were using herbicides. None at all. I came home from that tour early because of malaria. Spent 9 weeks in the Naval Hospital in Great Lakes. Went on to another duty station. Re-enlisted because that was the goal for a school. At the conclusion of my school, despite the fact that when I went in, the policy was that you got your choice at duty station if you finished 1, 2, or 3 in the class. Number 1, 2, and 3 in my class, we all wound up in the same unit at Dung Ha. Again, I had no idea we were using defoliant. I came home, I got out, and I realized because of 2 of my children that there was something pretty drastically wrong. So in 1977, I started looking for other veterans. And you know, in the late 70s, in the early 80s, well, in the late 70s, we had a tendency to hide. You didn't tell employers, prospective employers, that you were a Vietnam veteran. You dealt with your issues. In my case, it was, at that time, 2 kids with birth defects and a hell of an alcohol problem. It wasn't until about 1981 when I got hooked up with the folks who were putting together what became the New Jersey Agent Orange Commission that I realized that the use of herbicides, particularly Agent Orange, but there were also 17 other herbicides that we used in Vietnam, but mostly Agent Orange, somewhere between 20 and 21 million gallons of that particular herbicide were used over the entire area south of the 17th parallel, South Vietnam. South Vietnam, size-wise, is about the same size as the state of New Jersey, where I live. And from 1961 until January of 1971, we applied by airplane, fixed wing, helicopter, and by ground spraying all of those herbicides. So to the point of today, we realize that Vietnam is the war that keeps on giving. Because not only do we have our problems, our cancers, our disabilities that arise out of that exposure, for the first time in the history of warfare, we have a second, and what now appears very clearly to us to be a third generation affected by those exposures. If you served in the 3 Corps area, you Army guys, the Parrots Peak, Tay Ninh, you were among the most heavily defoliated of all American troops in Vietnam. If you served in I Corps, where they kept us Marines because they were afraid we'd take over the place if they let us out of I Corps, we were the second most heavily defoliated area. And then there was the Mekong, the Delta, the Rang Sut Special Zone, which had its own set of circumstances, but in the grand scheme of things, it was the third most heavily defoliated area in the entire country. I don't tell you this to scare the hell out of you. I tell you this because that's the fact. And it took my government, as the result of a lawsuit originally filed in 1979 and settled to the detriment of myself and my brother and sister veterans in May of 1985, to come to an understanding of just what the hell went wrong. The commanders loved this stuff because its purpose was to strip the foliage away from the trees, particularly the triple canopy. Anybody who's operated in triple canopy knows exactly what I'm talking about. It was also very good to clear out what was going to become a fire base, or an LZ, by the use of ground spray. Oh, we're spraying for mosquitoes. One time at Dong Ha, they told me they were spraying for fleas. Well, I haven't seen any fleas. Yeah, but you got Rock Marines living behind you. Okay, that explains the fleas, maybe. The point is, every one of us who went across the pond and spent weeks or months or years, you're exposed. Now, the scientists today will tell you that if we tested your blood or your fat tissue, we wouldn't find it. That's true, because it slowly excretes itself out of your body, but not before it does the damage. And it's one of those situations in history where I think we have to stand back and say, we use this as an instrument of war. And in a lot of cases, it did exactly what it was intended to do. A very good friend of mine and Mike Eckstein's, Admiral Elmo Zumwalt, when he was a vice admiral and in charge of all Navy forces in Vietnam, told us many years later that in a briefing that he was given when he came in country to take command, that he was assured that exposure to this chemical was no worse than an overdose of aspirin, whatever an overdose of aspirin amounts to. And so he used that as his guidance to very heavily defoliate the riversides and the stream beds. And I have pictures of guys on PBRs and swift boats spraying the riverbank, which in some cases was less than half of the distance to Rich over here, just with absolutely no protection. Guys standing ankle deep in this stuff on the boats. You would think that after all these years, I would have gotten a little less angry. But it's been impossible. Not when, at my age, and I'm 71, my health is in relatively good shape for the shape I'm in. But when I realized that a very good friend of mine, who holds this country's highest decoration for valor, the Medal of Honor, who is a year and a half younger than I am, who has about the same amount of time in country that I have, has disabilities and maladies out the yin-yang, and I look at him and I look at myself and I say, where are we? And then I realized I had 3 sons. He had 2 sons and a daughter. His kids are perfectly fine. His kids have given him 9 grandchildren. My kids my 2 surviving sons are still fighting their battles. One is going to be 45, the other one's going to be 49. That's the legacy that this experience left us with. When I first went for my Agent Orange screening exam in 1981, the last stop in that process was a visit to a psychiatrist because the VA was convinced that this was all in our heads. In some cases it was. The incidence of brain cancer in our population is 4.5 to 5 times what it is in the general population our age in this country. The Agent Orange screening exam is supposed to be applied by a protocol that's system-wide. But it's a joke. I went through mine at Wilmington, Delaware. Took 2.5 hours. I took a guy to the Bronx VA one day because he couldn't drive. He was in and out there in 25 minutes. So the system not only has said, you're full of it, they have done everything they can to deny us what we can get in order to live somewhat of a normal life. Now, a lot of this, over the years that I've been doing this, is directed to the wives and the children. And I know there are some women veterans in here, but I would venture a guess that most of the ladies in the audience are probably spouses or daughters. What I'm saying to you is, the guy in your life is not fouled up because he got old and got angry. He's fouled up because he spent a year in Vietnam and he's still trying to overcome what we were faced with. And the message that I want you to take out of here today is that there are a number of things legislatively that we're trying to accomplish, not only to help ourselves, but to help our kids and our grandchildren. And we're going to talk about that a little later on, and hopefully we'll have some time to talk about some of the research that's been done. But I want you to go out of here with the mindset that what we all need to do, because we all have one, and it's called a congressman, and we all have 2 senators. And you need to become a major pain in the ass. Anybody wants my card, I'll give it to you when we're done. I will send you the email address, the telephone number, and the staff person's name in your congressman or your senator's office so that you can say, I'm a constituent and I want you to do this. Sometimes you will get a letter back saying, well, I will consider your thoughts when this That's just not what I want to hear. What I want to hear is, yes, I will vote for H.R. 1969, or I'll vote for S. 901. Don't try to push us off. And I'm going to give the rest of this time to Mike Eckstein so he can talk about what he's going to talk about, which is something that I could probably spend 2 hours on, but I'll let Mike worry about that. Mike?
I had two or three things I was going to discuss, but I'm probably going to bring it down to one major issue that pertains to me and maybe many others here: birth defects. And I found out about birth defects when my first son was born in 1968. And he had certain issues that we were wondering, where did that come from? No one in the family had things like that. Teeth turning black and falling out, asthma. It just didn't happen. Then, since nothing resonated about Agent Orange or herbicides, we went to try to have another child. That child never made it out. And then another one, a year or two later, that one never made it out. And then, again, my second son was born with a birth defect, which is a defect that we don't have to go into. It was a structural. I guess, lo and behold, wanting to keep the population at the time of the Bronx and then New Jersey growing, we tried to have another child, and that child never made it out. And then my daughter was born after that with numerous female-related issues. Ovary syndrome, polycystic, it's called, small jaw, which wasn't female-related, but was structural-related. She had to have extensive surgeries throughout her life and is still going through it. Now, what really pisses me off at this point is I have 4 grandchildren. My newest grandson is adopted, and he's only 6 months old. My 3 grandchildren are through my offspring. All 3 of them have disabilities related to whether it's ADHD, sensory processing disorders, mood swings, and sometimes not so much violence, but on a 3-year-old shouldn't have such anger at times. So the birth defects mean a lot to me, and I'm still looking not so much for answers, I'm just looking for someone to hit. That's how it is now. and I just get angry when I see it. And what are you going to do? There's nothing to do at this point except do what we do here. Paul mentioned the research, the HR 1769 and S901, those bills for research, that if they get done, if they get passed, it at least move things ahead, maybe not only for us, which might be a little bit late, but for the newer vets, Iraq, Afghanistan. That bill, if you guys can correct me after, doesn't pertain to just Vietnam. And then you can correct that later if I'm wrong. But digressing away from birth defects, I know that will lead into next speaker. There's a group in Washington called the National Academy of Sciences. That group has been charged by the VA of doing reports of studies that other people have done. Last November, I was there, and I spoke for the 6th time over 22 years to that body. And pretty much I told them they were doing a hell of a rotten job. There's like 25 of the august doctors and scientists and whatever reviewing these studies. Do you know 22 years ago, they came up with 5 illnesses that there was a definite correlation to exposure to the dioxin of Agent Orange. You know, 22 years later, there's still 5 in that category. Now, they've moved categories around, illnesses from no association to inadequate, insufficient evidence of an association. What's the difference? You know, there used to be veterans used to have something called the benefit of the doubt. And the best way I can explain that is in baseball, when a runner and the throw gets to first base at the same time, the runner gets the benefit. Veterans used to get the benefit. No longer, not since the Agent Orange Act came through. You need to have statistical proof and evidence that this disorder is related. Even though the IARC, the International Cancer Body, has said dioxin is a known human carcinogen, which is cancer causer. The National Toxicology Program finally agreed to that after they were stopped by restaurateurs in New York because they were afraid if people knew dioxin can cause illnesses, people wouldn't buy the meat. And this is another source of dioxin exposure, not having to do anything with Vietnam, is what's in our normal lives. And so my presentation at the NAS last November didn't go over too well, and some people disagreed with me, and I don't blame them. You know, that's a place where illnesses did get discussed. But if you look at the manpower, person power, excuse me, that was used over these 20-something years, to me, it went nowhere. We just wasted time and spent money and wasted time. And I know we have, am I? Still have time. Do we? Still have time. Oh, okay. Not a hell of a lot. All right. I always have something else to say. Skin cancer. Here's another issue that, in 2006 report from the National Academy of Sciences, we're getting close to saying there's a possibility of skin cancer. Now we're 2015, there's still a possibility. Yet, by other researchers, especially at University of Buffalo, and also a doctors group called the Society of Plastic Surgeons, have come out with this a definite correlation of non-melanoma skin cancers, which are basal cell carcinomas and basal cell sarcomas, I think that's the other one, or squamous cell, whichever is the next one up in severity. And what do you say to these people? I've had 3 or 4 skin cancers and about 150 pre-ones taken off. Now, we don't want to discuss us, but to get the point across, what does it take for Uncle Sam to do what's right? When I got drafted, I didn't, not like Paul, I didn't plan on spending a career in the military. But who knew that I am spending the rest of my life, since I'm 70. What happened in those years in the military? It never leaves. It doesn't leave you. And Paul's one of the persons who kept me going on this issue when I was going to step down. I said, Mike, just 2 more years. That was like 14 years ago. So I'm not too happy with Paul. But last thing in Florida, the company called the Birth Defects Research for Children. They have a registry online, and I'm not promoting that. Just if you go there and look at some of the statistics that they've put together, and as you know, Dr. Berger has mentioned, you know, that's a company. It's self-reporting, so it's not so much of a real study. It's self-reporting, but it's been accepted pretty much around the country as a guide. And wherever you look at a toxic-related disorder, the numbers, the graphs, I can't show it to you really, it's too small. The graphs are so out of line. The Vietnam veteran or exposed military veteran, I remember, was dioxin, Agent Orange was sprayed all over the place. Puerto Rico, Camp Drum, name it, it's been used everywhere. Guam, Okinawa, all the place, Korea. So it's just Vietnam veterans. And the numbers are so out of line for ADD, ADHD, sensory disorders where your eyes and ears and nose pick up the sense, but your brain takes a longer time to process it. And it's called sensory processing disorder. It's training, and you can teach children to work through that. But that's the legacy. And you know, the legacy is, I guess, Dr. Berger is going to talk about legacies. And if that wasn't a perfect lead-in, I'll relinquish.
One of the key points that Mike made towards the end relative to the era Vietnam veteran is that it wasn't only those who served in Vietnam who were exposed. It ranges from Puerto Rico to the Korean DMZ, many bases in the States, those who were associated with the C-123 aircraft, even after the war. Just recently, they've recognized on certain reserve Air Force bases that there was exposure. You didn't have to be of the Vietnam generation, but around a Vietnam generation aircraft that hadn't been cleaned out properly. It just goes on and on. Many Air Force bases and Army bases, we use that stuff just to defoliate around the fence lines for security purposes. So if you served anywhere, you might want to inquire during this generation, this period we're talking about is primarily the 60s and 70s, okay?
The first 2 speakers have alluded to this, if not directly, certainly indirectly. There is a legacy, and it is. There are multi-generational effects of exposure to herbicides such as Agent Orange. As Paul said, there were lots of them that were used, all right? And they had particular molecular configurations, for those of you who got a little chemistry in the background. But as a result of that, and this was also alluded to briefly, and hopefully we can talk a little bit about it later on, as a result of these kinds of things, We are working to support passage of the Toxic Research Exposure Act in the Senate, Senate 901, and House Resolution 1769. And maybe we can talk a little bit about them later on. I do want to acknowledge the fact that a friend and colleague, whom I've known almost as long as I've known Paul, Peter Kahn, Dr. Peter Kahn, professor of biochemistry at Rutgers University, was scheduled to share time with me today on the panel. But unfortunately, Peter is suffering some problems, medical problems, and at the last minute called and said that he couldn't make it. So what I've tried to do is incorporate some of the items that Peter sent forward to bring up during this discussion this afternoon. And so if it seems disjointed in parts, I was trying to weave parts of our discussions together. I hope to take a little time today to look at some of the scientific and medical questions, and then we'll take a look at some of the ways that science has been used and misused, as my colleague Mike has indicated. The diseases that are currently recognized as being associated with exposure to Agent Orange can be found in the Agent Orange Guide. If you haven't got one, make sure you pick one up on your way out, okay? And just because I'm the author of that, I'm not trying to sell them, all right? But take a look at it because, as Mike said, there's a panel of scientists that meets, as required under the Agent Orange Act of 1991, every 2 years to review the literature. I am proud to say that during the last review, all right, VVA, I compiled and sent forward a 21-page bibliography of the scientific papers, okay, that show some interaction, okay, between pesticides and human body systems. Now, the VA recognizes like 16, I think it is, 16 is it? 16 or 18. They've divided your body up into systems. So I looked through the literature, okay, and pulled these articles. I wasn't the only one. I had a lot of help from George Claxton. Some of you know him, as well as a couple of other folks, really heavy-duty supporters of our efforts in this area. Anyway, so we turned that in the last time around. This time around, the number of articles has grown tremendously, and this year's, which I finished a month ago, is 41 pages, and this will be turned in. Now, as I said, it's organized based on the content of the paper as to whether it's in a human biological system or there's the giant category other, which includes animal studies and that kind of thing, okay? So at least VVA is pushing the information forward. And for the first time ever, all right, I have to say that the current panel has been authorized to look at scientific papers that are published in non-English peer-reviewed journals. So there's a lot of work being done in Japan, for example, as you would think, on the use of pesticides, herbicides, and their impact upon human populations. So that's kind of one of the things that we're doing. But let's kind of shift back here. I mentioned the diseases that are listed in the Agent Orange Guide. Now, it's reasonable, it's very reasonable to say, without a doubt, that every one of those diseases can arise from other causes other than exposure to Agent Orange. And oftentimes when you're faced with an illness, one doesn't know with certainty whether it's related to wartime service or whether the disease would have been caused somewhere else. But the point being is that Mike has said in many cases, the epidemiology, the science, okay, clearly shows that chronic exposure, in many cases, to 2,4,5-T, which is a component, chemical component of Agent Orange, is associated with illnesses. Soft tissue sarcoma, for example, non-Hodgkin's lymphoma. This is due to the fact that the dioxin contaminant in the 2,4,5-T, okay, has been identified as a causal agent. Mike said that this panel established under the Institute of Medicine, and there are different panels every 2 years. It's not the same folks. All right, takes a look at the studies and forwards their information to the VA as to whether or not there's a likelihood of association. Now, we were very fortunate under the regime, the VA regime, of the former director, who was one of us, all right, who actually received a Purple Heart for his service in Vietnam. He actually read the report of that IOM panel. He actually read it. And that's why we got Parkinson's, the hairy cell leukemia, and ischemic heart disease added to the list. And that's because the general read the stuff and made the decision. It took a little bit of pressure, too, from groups such as VVA, but that's why we got those. So, there's one other component to legislation that's coming up this year, all right, that we haven't mentioned yet, and that is the reauthorization of the Agent Orange Act. If it's not reauthorized in this session of Congress, all right, all that stuff about IOM panels and all of that stuff is dead. It's gone out the window. So while I will argue strongly for the support of both the Senate and House resolutions that I mentioned earlier, don't forget, we need reauthorization of the Agent Orange Act so that we can continue our work in this area. Now, I'd like to take a little time to talk about one particular disease that's associated and is on the list, and that's prostate cancer. Some of you who follow my columns or my articles in the VVA Veteran know that I've been in the thick of this for a couple of years over prostate cancer. At the present time, there are only 2 ways to diagnose prostate cancer. One is called the PSA test, which basically takes a look at hormone levels, okay? And it's been shown that there's an effect, an impact by exposure to herbicides, okay, particular Agent Orange and some of the other rainbow herbicides, that causes that hormone to increase, okay, which is bad stuff. The other way is the DRE, the digital rectal examination. The Marines remember this from what I said at the earlier thing. And what it really is your prostate, okay, increases in size. And a good doc, a proctologist, all right, can actually tell whether your prostate has increased in size. So the combination of the two. Well, okay, there's a couple of things going on. There's a group, a task force, okay, that makes recommendations on screening and testing of diseases. They then forward that information or publish that information, and insurance companies and other healthcare related organizations make a decision on their coverage based on the recommendation of this task force. In the case of, now this task force, like the IOM appointed task force, is made up of scientists, doctors, MDs, okay, usually who have a background in the specific disease. and they are supposed to be from outside any of the agencies that are considering adding the treatment or the diagnosis to the major list, okay, the task force list. Well, on the one with prostate cancer, it turns out that the former Deputy Assistant Director for the VA, who's gone, by the way, we were able to influence some pressure to get him gone. But before he left, okay, he appointed 2 of his own people to that committee. 2 of his own people to that committee. And that committee said, wait a minute, prostate cancer, hey, particularly among veterans, let's not worry about it, particularly in the case of Vietnam veterans, because they're getting older. And we do know that prostate cancer in its early stages, if detected in men over 70, in its earliest stages, is slow growing. Now, I mentioned the 2 ways that you can diagnose the disease, okay? Neither of which are pleasant, or to say the least. The only other time you can diagnose prostate cancer is when it has spread to other parts of your body, all right? So it shows up on CAT scans and x-rays. By then, you are in deep doo-doo, all right? So, our problems with this task force's recommendation, all right, they give it a letter grades like you got in high school or in college, A, B, C, D, F. They had dropped prostate cancer diagnosis, all right, down to the C level, or in some cases, a couple of them, the VA guys, voted D, which meant, okay, so insurance companies don't pay attention, you know, the whole business. Yet, the evidence that was presented to the IOM clearly showed that there's a relationship between exposure to Agent Orange and prostate cancer. That's why prostate cancer is on the list. But then we had this this person at the VA say, wait a minute, we're not going to do the prostate cancer screening anymore because the task force report says it's a grade C. So anyway, to make a long story short, we exchanged words, to say the least, with this deputy dog at the VA who claimed that, no, this was, you know, not what he meant when he sent out a directive saying don't do prostate cancer screening anymore. He changed his tune. But we do know, as Paul pointed out, okay, there's a lot of variation in the Agent Orange exam. And I'm a great believer that whether you like it or not, you should be tested for prostate cancer as part of that. All right? And in many cases, physicians will tell you, no, we shouldn't do that because prostate cancer doesn't have a grade of A or B. Remember what happened when they tried to lower the grade on breast cancer in women several years ago? Women got so pissed off about that, and we're talking about the mammograms, okay? They got the grade raised back up. That's what we need to do with prostate cancer, okay? I don't care if I'm 70 years old and it grows slower in me. I don't want to die from prostate cancer because some bozo at the VA, okay, says that the U.S. task force gives it a grade of C. That's not justice for America's veterans. So, in any case, I'll get off my high horse about prostate cancer, but there are other diseases very similar, all right? And we need to keep fighting for those because that's our legacy. That's our legacy. The last thing I want to address is, as you'll see, and I've said it a couple of times, you'll see the list of diseases, okay, associated with our children in the Agent Orange Guide. There's 1, spina bifida, for the children born of male Vietnam veterans exposed to phenoxy herbicides, especially Agent Orange. There's lots for women veterans. Why do you think that is? There were more men who served in Vietnam. More men. That translates to dollars, okay? Not as many women Vietnam veterans exposed to Agent Orange file claims for their kids. It doesn't cost the feds that much money. And I don't care what anybody says anywhere, anytime, when it comes to diseases, diagnoses, treatments, etc., associated with your military service, all right? It's all about the dollar. It's all about the dollar. So I'll bring it full circle and point out that the one thing that's holding up the Senate 901 and H.R. 1769 is OMB. That's the Office of Budget Management. Now, Congress, in its wisdom or lack thereof, all right, says that any bill that goes through, OMB has to take a look at it and score it. How much is it going to cost? Remember I said what I did about money? Okay. So we actually, with the help of the senators, the original senators and House members, sponsors of the bill, with their aides, had written in to both of those pieces of legislation, okay, it's not going to cost any new money. We want the research stuff taken out of the research budget that's already there, because they're not doing any research on our kids and grandkids and the diseases they suffer as a result of our exposure. It's a no-brainer. The money's already there. But the VA stepped in and said, wait a minute, we still have to have OMB take a look at it. Right now, we've got no answer from OMB. And what we have heard, however, is that they're diddling around with making projections. You don't make projections. You either have the cost factors there or not. We're not asking for new money. And so when you do speak to your congresspeople about these pieces of legislation, please remind them we're not asking for new monies. We're asking for it out of the current research budget, because they don't currently take a look at any of these diseases that I've been talking about. Last but not least, I want to make sure that I get a couple of things in here which will segue into our next presentation. And that is some other areas in which policy and science issues come up regarding pesticides and herbicides. I told my colleagues the other night, just last night, as we got together beforehand, there's a paper that came out this week. Well, it's not actually out in publication yet. It comes out next month in one of the peer-reviewed journals that shows that households that use certain kinds of pesticides, and in the little blurb that I got, it didn't specifically identify them because the paper's not published yet. Okay, it comes out next month. Pesticides that are used around the home and in the yards, in your yards. The ones that are used in your home cause leukemia in kids. All right, and there's a couple of other diseases. So when we get that, when that paper comes out and those brands are identified, and that we'll publish something about it both in the Web Weekly, hopefully in the Veteran, and send it out on the web through the Agent Orange network, because it raises some real questions, again, about what some of our companies and our government are doing. But it also leads us to discussions about genetically modified organisms. There are people who believe that all GMOs are intrinsically bad. I don't agree with that. I've been eating strawberries grown in the United States for years, as well as potatoes and stuff. Those have been genetically modified for years. And it is a genetic modification to protect those plants from cold. That's why you have strawberries from California in the middle of January. All right? So, that doesn't mean I think that all GMOs are good. The devil's in the details, and we don't have time to go deeply into this particular issue, but my colleague, Kelly, Professor Kelly, will talk a little bit about it. My point here is it depends on which GMO you're talking about. And I think, last but not least, people react negatively when you bring up the subject of GMOs for two main reasons. First, GMOs have been forced upon us by large corporations and their allies in the agricultural field and at some of our ag universities. In many cases, they tell us they're safe, and from the corporate point of view, that's the end of the story. Anyone who disagrees is branded as a not serious or not science person, and after all, we use these crops to feed millions in lesser developed countries, correct? I mean, lots of rice that's grown overseas, for example, in Southeast Asia, Southwestern Asia, are genetically modified crops. Most GMOs have been designed to enhance corporate profits without regard to public welfare, all right? And there's a couple of examples. If we have time later, ask me the question, what they are, and I'll give you some examples. But in any case, it is with that I will segue into the next speaker, excuse me. And I want to thank you for the opportunity to get up here and talk to you about this stuff. It's very serious. It's very serious stuff. And last but not least, to all of you, okay, in my cohort, take care of your own health. Because if you don't, you can't take care of the health of your kids and your grandkids. I need you. I need you to cover my back in Washington so I can stand up before these committees, before these agencies, and say, let's go for it, or you're full of it. So thank you.
My name is Kelly Allen. I am an associate professor of English here at the community college. And I'm sure that you're already wondering, why is there an English professor up here talking about Agent Orange? I am a generalist. I'm not a scientist. My research focuses on culture, politics, and history. And just through sheer fate, a lot of my research over the last, say 8 to 10 years has focused on food, specifically food agency, food access, and food justice. What I believe in as a citizen is in economic, social, and food justice. What I hope to show is how what we've heard today plays a part within a much larger picture. So kind of what we've heard here is about the complexities of the conversation, just how elusive it is to really get a point across or get an answer to our questions. So I hope that as I talk about our current food system, that we'll see how truly complicated this conversation really is. But I believe that for us to know what is happening, we need to also focus on why and how. So I'm going to kind of step back in time a little bit. Okay, so we're going to go back long before the Vietnam War, and I want to talk about the deterioration of the family farm. So when we think of the family farm, we think of this beautiful pastoral the red barn, you have the pigs, the chickens, maybe an orchard, and the family up on the porch, and then the crops throughout the field. The deterioration of that picture, that thing that became part of who we are as Americans. So I'm sure that for those of you who are up in the lobby, you saw a bunch of posters that were advertising agriculture and the American identity. That's kind of that aesthetic that I'm talking about. But during the late 19th century into the early 20th century, our country it developed into the Industrial Revolution. And as the Industrial Revolution started taking way, people started leaving the rural farms and headed to the cities as a way to find jobs and gain economic autonomy. Because if you think about the way agriculture was during this time, it was mostly done without tractors, because tractors really didn't come into play until like the 1880s. And even those tractors were very simple machines, mostly made for hauling. So it was usually done with animal power and people power. It was very, very hard work. And it was not something that everyone wanted to invest their lives in. For those of you who are familiar with Maslow's hierarchy of needs, there's that piece up at the top where we have self-actualization. Self-actualization comes from being able to have luxury in life, to sit back and relax and think and read the paper. It doesn't come from waking up at dawn and working until well past dusk and then doing that over and over again every single day of the year. That isn't where kind of that luxury comes from. So people, they found working in the factories in the cities very appealing. So they started leaving rural America and they went towards the cities. So that's where the family farm just started to dissolve a bit. But also at this time, as I said, we started getting tractors. And that's when farming became mechanized. And then when you start bringing tractors into the picture, you also start bringing in debt. So these are farmers that they lived off the land, and they had just like a small bit of income that was achieved through sale of their crops to their neighbors, and that's a key thing, to their neighbors. And then the rest went to sustain themselves. So here we have all these people fleeing our rural farms. Well, the work still needs to get done. So then the way that this work is getting done is that they are now mortgaging their farms and buying tractors. Unfortunately, due to like circumstances of poor weather or just poor agricultural practices, sometimes they couldn't make ends meet. And then what ends up happening is that the bank takes over the farm. One of the key points in history where this happened to just hundreds of families was during the Dust Bowl in the 1930s. So during the 1930s, due to poor agricultural practices, as I said, which mostly stemmed from the fact that these farmers had bought tractors that they couldn't pay for, and they were aggressively tilling the land, trying to just get every penny they could out of it. But what had happened is, as they are just over-tilling, they're not letting their fields go fallow, a drought came along, and then no new crops came up. And then when no new crops came up, year after year after year, that dirt started turning to silt. And then strong winds came through, and it just blew all that dirt away. They couldn't make ends meet, and the banks took the farms. And then that's when we have more people fleeing from rural America and heading towards cities. A lot of them headed out west, for those of you who are familiar with the Grapes of Wrath. A lot of them headed west to take on what was called migrant work on other farms. So here we have this critical moment in our history where the people who are growing our food go from people we know, people that we see in town, people that we see in church, to our food production is being taken care of and run by banks, and it's being taken care of by corporations. It is being taken care of by people whom we don't know. So that was kind of the beginning of it, and then kind of where it leads into the conversation today is during World War II, I believe it was the DuPont company, they started using fixed nitrogen for explosives. So a lot of the bombs that were used during World War II were nitrogen-based. At the end of the war, there was still a lot of nitrogen left. And the company isn't going to sit on this unused asset, so what they did is they tried to find different ways that they could be using nitrogen for profit. And one of those ways was for chemical fertilizers. So for any of you who know about agriculture, you know that plants, the green part of the plants, need nitrogen. And one of the biggest feeders of nitrogen is corn. And so if you go driving, around the Lehigh Valley and you go through, go past a farm, you're going to notice that they're growing corn. So there's a bunch of other crops, and I'm sure that we're going to talk about that when we get in with the GMOs, but that is where kind of the leftovers of war, if you will, started making their way into the American farmland. Now, the people who are taking care of these farms, they don't have to answer to their neighbors because the people who are eating this food aren't their neighbors. The people who are eating this food don't know who is growing this food, as I said. So we started kind of like playing with science a bit, if you will, as farmers, rather than having this very real relationship with nature. So that was kind of the beginning of our chemical relationship. And then in the early 1970s, it might have been 1971, the Secretary of Agriculture for Richard Nixon, Earl Butz, some of you might be familiar with that name, he coined the now just, I guess, infamous, and for me as a study, as a researcher of food, makes me quite sick to think about it. He said this to the American farmers, that you need to get big or you need to get out. So what they were doing is that they were forcing on the American farmers to start growing commodity crops in large volumes. And if the small American farmer, and this is usually someone that had around 50 acres, if they couldn't be a part of that game, they were forced out. So then what happens now is that we go from having farmers who are looking after 50 acres, which with one family and a couple farmhands, that's something that's manageable. So we go from that kind of food production to a food production where you have, say, maybe half a dozen individuals on tractors taking care of thousands of acres of farmland. When you are taking care of thousands of acres of farmland, it is impossible to take care of kind of the pests that arise. It's impossible to go out there and weed. I know that I wouldn't want to weed 1,000 acres, but it's impossible to look over the weeds. We have these new pests coming in, but also what is happening is they're getting on these tractors and they're taking care of one crop. So with Earl Butz, with his policies in place, what they started doing is they started taking the diversification of the American farms and they started consolidating it. So now you have farms that's growing one thing. So now there's no longer the cows, there's no longer the hogs, the chickens, the orchards. All of that is gone. Now what we have is were planting corn from fence row to fence row. Now, granted, like partway through, they realized that, oh gosh, we can't just plant corn all the time, even though we were bringing in this nitrogen fertilizer. So now they're starting to do crop rotation, you know, so it kind of looks a little green. So now when you drive down the streets, you're either going to see fields of corn or you're going to see fields of soybeans, because soybeans are, they're called nitrogen fixers. So if, you know, back, you know, prior to Europeans coming, the Cherokee, their farming practice, they had this thing called the Three Sisters, where they're growing milling corn with pole beans and squash. And what they're doing is they're all kind of like working in symbiosis, but the corn, which was sucking all the nitrogen out of the soil, was being replaced with the nitrogen from the beans. But however, that was no longer happening. So this consolidation of crops eventually requires additional inputs. And one of the early inputs that we started seeing in agriculture was DDT. I'm sure that a lot of you are familiar with that. And Rachel Carson's book, The Silent Spring, kind of really brought the negative effects of DDT to the forefront. Now, unfortunately, you know, through hindsight, we're seeing that Rachel Carson's research was based on a lot of speculation and fear, but also a lot of the people who are doing the research to point that out about her work are people who are part of the chemical industry. So what we are finding ourselves in now is that that we have this back and forth between two major groups. We have those who are talking for science, I suppose, talking for the chemical use, saying that it's safe, and then we have those who are saying that it's not safe and that we need to go 100% organic. And if I had the time, I would like to talk about how even organic isn't what it says that it really is. So what we start having here is kind of this war of language in Washington about like what can and cannot be used. And unfortunately, what has happened is that companies like Monsanto, Dow, and DuPont, they've got all the money. So what I have found in my research, so like I like to focus a lot of my academic attention on the conversations or the debate between organic and what we're calling conventional. For those who know me and the work that I do out at our agricultural space here at the college, they would think that my knee-jerk reaction to the agricultural discussion would be anti-GMO and anti-chemicals, which it isn't, because there's a lot of like faulty science going on in both ends. But now what we're starting to find is that there's this war of visibility, if you will, in regards to the argument. So we have companies like DuPont really isn't in the mix as much as it had been in the past, but Dow and Monsanto is investing a tremendous amount of money in academic research to kind of support their claims, to say why their products are safe. And I think that's the obstacle that a lot of you are running into now in your kind of quest to bring awareness to Agent Orange. Unfortunately, what is happening is that as you're making your progress by going in through the front door, companies like Monsanto and Dow and their and their constituents, they're coming in through the back door, and they're setting up policies usually through the EPA and the USDA to kind of muddy the language a bit so that way your argument can never gain any traction. See, the United States is much different than our global counterparts. Canada and most industrialized countries in Europe have banned 2,4-D. They have banned the use of it until the proper amount of testing has been done to prove that it is safe. So the philosophy of these countries is, you've got this thing, you need to prove to me that it's good before we'll put it into service out in our fields. In the United States, thanks to the legislation of these predominant chemical companies, our philosophy is, you need to prove to me that it's bad so that I don't. And that is really, really hard to do. So yes, 2,4-D is one of the major chemicals in Agent Orange. But that's not the only chemical in Agent Orange. So when we try to make the argument that, okay, so now we have this new weed and feed that Scott's Turf Builder is using that has 2,4-D in it. So by the way, for those of you who are using a weed and feed on your lawn for that kind of that monocultured aesthetic, chances are you are spreading 2,4-D on your lawn. And I'm not like pointing any fingers, but I just want to say, hey, by the way. But 2,4-D in Scott's Turf Builder, just like Agent Orange, has a whole bunch of other stuff in the mix. And what the chemical companies have done is that they're saying, well, you can't prove that it's that one thing. How do you know? How do you know there's not this other thing? So one of the experiments that have been done with 2,4-D was on mice. And they said that mice that have been injected with certain amounts of 2,4-D have grown cancers at a certain percent. But then what the chemical companies are doing is that they're coming in and saying, well, no, it wasn't that. It was because the mice were eating moldy food, and part of that mold has a chemical component that also causes tumors. So you know what? We really can't say. So Mike said something beautiful earlier where, well, you said a number of things that were beautiful earlier. But like one was, what is it going to take for Uncle Sam to make things right? But kind of also on top of that, one of the things that he said is, when are we going to get the benefit of the doubt? So right now, the benefit of the doubt is not kind of in the hands of the American people. And I don't mean to kind of start like some kind of crazy conspiracy theory thing or, any kind of fear stuff, because that's not it. Because we need to start asking some very, very critical questions of ourselves as we're also trying to move forward in asking critical questions of our government and these companies who are in charge of our food production. But yes, if this is a country of we the people, well then we should have the benefit of the doubt. So if we have a group of veterans who are coming forward and saying, you know what, this thing that happened is making us sick, well then we the people should get the benefit of the doubt, right? But it doesn't seem like that's happening. So it's not that it doesn't seem that it's happening, it's not happening. And the reason why is because in regards to our military and in regards to our food production, it seems like they're hanging out with each other because they're the same companies. So if something happened in Vietnam due to Agent Orange, to point the finger at that company is also to point the finger at the person who was supplying you with your food. And the thing that has really muddied this up in the last, 15, 20 years is the introduction of GMOs. So before, when I was saying that we have all these, different chemical components within Scott's Turf Builder or Agent Orange or Monsanto's Roundup Ready, well, when we start bringing in GMOs, that's another unknown. And that's another thing where we weren't asked, you know, hey, what do you think about this new product? Instead, it's something that, as you had said, was being forced upon us. So our voice, I think, and this is part of my argument, is that our voice needs to get stronger. But our voice can't get stronger until we show that we have some kind of self-reliance on things that are other than what these companies are producing. We need to be self-sufficient, if you will. Like usually, my concluding remark in talks like this is, you know what, if you want to take control over whether something is organic or whether something is commercially grown, plant your own food. Like I kind of wish that I would have thought of this in advance, but like I was really hoping that I could have one of those WPA posters behind me of the Victory Gardens. Like during World War II, like we saw that growing our own food, having food close to us was an important part of what it meant to be American, but it was also something that was important, it was an important element in being free. So we need to kind of like take control of our own food system, and then ultimately we'll be able to kind of take control over the conversation. Because already we're in this slippery slope. Because GMOs, it was already been brought up that, you know what, GMOs necessarily aren't bad. And that's true, they aren't bad. What's bad about GMOs is that they encourage the use of pesticides that hurt people. Like that's where the scientific data is coming from, is that these chemicals cause harm. Now granted, yes, we had the whole cocktail thing going on that we can't nail down, but yes, they cause harm. But now we're being misdirected saying that, oh, we got to get rid of GMOs. Instead of, hey, we got to get rid of the thing that GMOs encourage, because it isn't just GMO agriculture that uses these chemicals. So I watched a talk, you know, I'm trying to put GMOs into perspective here, but I watched a talk about a month ago from a gentleman who, during the 80s and 90s, was one of the biggest proponents for the removal of GMOs from our food system. And just recently, he, you know, from reading the science, he has changed his mind because he realizes that a lot of the claims that he was making were based on fear, they were made based on assumptions, and they were made without science. So if you look at the cornfields through the Lehigh Valley, chances are pretty good that the corn you're looking at is Monsanto's B2 corn. Monsanto's B2 corn, one of the genetically modified qualities of that corn is that it produces a higher yield than your standard corn. So we are getting more bushels out of each acre than we would without it. So that's one thing. Now, there's this debate that's going on, and it has been going on for several years now, about global climate change. There is no ignoring that there are several places in the world, not just in the United States, but in the world, that are hurting for water. There are places in Australia, Africa, the western United States that are hurting for water. We need drought-tolerant crops. These companies, with their GMOs, are providing drought-tolerant crops. We're providing crops that can adapt themselves to different climates. These are good things for our growing population. Like, we need to feed people. So one of the arguments that this gentleman made was, okay, well, we can either keep using GM crops, or we can create a mandatory law that couples can only have one child. Because that's essentially where we've gotten to. That's that slippery slope. Because we've started just like eating all this stuff, and then like our population just continues to grow and grow and grow. Now, it isn't like growing to the scarcity that some might make us believe, but there's no ignoring the fact that we've got a lot of people on this planet and we need to feed them. Now, another element to this, now here's where kind of the pro-organic movement comes in, is that, well, we don't need these genetically modified crops because with companion planting and crop rotation, we can feed the world. They're right, however, we would need to deforest all of South America to get enough farmland to do it. And we're already losing farmland to our increasing housing needs. So we need to be able to grow food on a larger scale with less land. And right now, with the kind of corner that we've painted ourselves in, we can't do that without GMOs. So again, we need to start asking some critical questions of ourselves. What is it that we really want? So from an Agent Orange position, is the argument that we want to have anti-GMO? Is that the fight that we want to take? Like, I would have to say no. I think that the position that we want to take is you need to ask before you do. Before you start introducing these chemicals into our farmlands, which are creating dead zones in the ocean, which, yes, these chemicals in the areas where they're being used, there is scientific proof that humans are being negatively affected. So before we go and start using these chemicals, the science, the testing needs to be done. We need to know that they're good before we implement them. We kind of need to take a lesson from our European allies and our neighbors up north. They need to ask before they do.
First one, and I'm going to make this into a two-parter to show if there is or is not some relationship. A person asked, what birth defects can we expect among the children and grandchildren? Do we know anything about that right now? And what illnesses and diseases can we expect among the Vietnam veterans who were exposed to Agent Orange?
All right, I'll jump in at least for the first part of the question, and that is we don't know the extent. Okay, there are those birth defects that are currently listed. All right, as I mentioned earlier, you can find those that are currently recognized by the VA in the Agent Orange Guide. Was also referred to, Mike, I believe, referred to Betty Medecky's outfit, who is collecting such information, the Birth Defects Registry. Now, okay, I hate to get into the technical aspect of it, and I'll try and keep it to a minimum. But, all right, there are federal rules that govern the sharing of personal health care information, okay? And its collection, storage, all that sort of thing. Some of it is what you have heard commonly expressed in the press as HIPAA, all right? It's not just HIPAA. There are other federal regulations governed by Health and Human Services that cover the collection and sharing of such data. So I can't tell you how many diseases that Betty has accounted for. Maybe Mike knows because he works much more closely with Betty in the center down there than I have. And I know that Mike has told me that when you look at the general population and diseases in kids and stuff and compare it to the children of Vietnam vets, all right, our kids and grandkids are off the charts on a number of these things. But that's what I can say about the kids right now.
And the second part was what illnesses and diseases can we expect from Agent Orange amongst us veterans? And I guess maybe one of the ways to address that is to talk about or list the presumptive conditions. It was mentioned that it is in that orange bulletin there, the list of them. Does anybody want to go through that list and just mention a few of them?
Well, obviously the list is in there. Let me.
I think one of the things you have to keep in mind is that when we first came to understand that there was something wrong, and this was as far back as probably 1969, 1970, when we started to get the reports of cancers in our brothers who were coming home. And these were cancers that generally you didn't see in, at that point, 28, 32-year-old men. These are cancers that you saw in somebody who was our age now. One of the things you have to understand about this particular dioxin, and there are hundreds of kinds of dioxin in our environment. This particular dioxin, TCDD2378, that stands for a word that's 32 letters long, and I've never learned how to pronounce it. But 2378 came out of the marriage of 2,4-D, which Professor Allen talked about, and 2,4,5-T. And for many years, we thought that 2,4,5-T was the bad actor of the two. And so 2,4,5-T was banned in 1971 by the World Health Organization, and subsequently we were unable to use it in the manufacture of any additional herbicides. Not that we needed them, because there is about 1.5 million gallons of that crap sitting on Johnson Atoll out in the Pacific Ocean. The purpose of Agent Orange, the 2378 came about by the marriage of these two chemicals. It was unavoidable. If the chemical companies had adhered to the protocol to manufacture Agent Orange, which means they would have created the marriage of these two chemicals at a low heat over a long period of time, the poison wouldn't have been as concentrated. However, in its rush to get the product to Vietnam for use, the United States government imposed deadlines on the chemical companies and said, make it, get it there yesterday. The chemical company's answer to that was to create this stuff by marrying these two chemicals at very high temperatures, 4,000 degrees plus. It created the desired chemical, but it created a dioxin that was the most potent we have ever created. And so as a consequence, we literally saturated this country, the size of the state I live in, with not only Agent Orange, but Agent Purple and Agent Blue and Agent White, and so on and so on and so on. Agent Orange was among the worst because of its potency. It's an artificial hormone. And that artificial hormone was what was the cause of the onset of cancers in 28 to 32-year-old men that should not have had those cancers until they were our age, in our 70s. It was a process where we not only poisoned a generation, the 2.9 million of us who went in country, we poisoned a subsequent generation, and if we're to believe the anecdotal information we have now, we've poisoned a third generation. One of the questions was, what can we expect? I personally, and I'm not a scientist, but I expect, based on what I've read and looked at and seen and heard over all of these years, is that in our great-grandchildren, we're probably looking at psychological disabilities as opposed to physical disabilities. There will be an increase in ADHD. There will be an increase in dyslexia. There will be an increase in the sensory part that Mike talks about. Those are the kinds of things that we expect to see in the generations that are going to be out from us. As far as we're concerned, what we've seen is pretty much what we're going to see. As we age and as our bodies continue to deteriorate, it's only going to cause greater and greater problems. One of the things you have to understand about dioxin, any dioxin, but this bad boy in particular, is that it comes to rest ultimately in the fat tissue of your body. And it will stay there until the day you die, unless your body experiences some trauma. And then it's reintroduced out of the fat tissue into the bloodstream and then begins to cause problems with the major organ systems. It's not a pretty picture, but that's what we're looking at.
If I can add one thing to what Paul said, he's focused primarily on phenoxy herbicides. I want to add one thing, and that is Agent Blue. Agent Blue is not the same kind of herbicide, chemically, all right? It contains cyanide, and it works differently, all right? It was primarily used for narrow leaf crops, such as rice, bananas, and a couple other things that grew over there. And regardless of what the government says, we did spray it on the enemy's crops, okay? Even though that's against the Geneva Convention. In any case, there are cancers linked to cyanide, all right, such as bladder cancer and kidney cancer. The problem is that there are other carcinogens that we take in. Smoking is one of them, all right, that also is linked to bladder cancer. So what we're hoping is that with the Toxic Research Exposure Act, we can get some research focused, okay, on decoupling smoking from exposure to Agent Blue, all right? So that we can say, if you've got bladder cancer, you served in Vietnam, or any of those other places where they used Agent Blue, and you've got kidney or bladder cancer, that the VA will recognize that. So, and one other element, colleague, I don't see her out there right now, but she asked me about ALS, all right, and the VA, I understand, even though it's on not on this list of Agent Orange, they are recognizing claims for ALS as a result of exposures. Pardon? Yeah, Lou Gehrig's disease, sorry.
Okay, next question, and this came from several people in different forms. Has there been any research done on children or our allies, and what have they reported? And in specific, a couple of them asked, have there been any studies done on the Vietnamese, and what do they say?
Well, it depends on whether you want to believe them or not. But at least in terms of they don't have the same kind of recognition system, and you know, obviously there's no VA over there, that kind of thing. But the fact of the matter is that they claim that there's a lot of physical disabilities in particular, and some emotional or mental disabilities. And of course, when that subject comes up in a public debate or conference or any of that sort of thing, we do see pictures of children and grandchildren of Vietnamese exposed to Agent Orange with missing limbs and disfiguration and other kinds of things. So we know that it happens. It has happened to the degree they don't have the same kind of system for tracking or any of that. So it's kind of impossible at this point in time, other than to take whatever the Vietnamese government says is what is happening.
You want to add to that?
This is from the August body of the Institute of Medicine, and I think this was from the update of 2008. And bear with me a minute here. Dioxins have not been shown to alter DNA sequences. Paren, they do not produce mutations, which is contrary from what I thought. So the potential effects in offspring are limited to epigenetic effects. Two possible mechanisms could theoretically produce affected children if sperm stem cells are altered by exposure. They could continue to produce altered sperm, and mobilization of dioxin from storage in adipose tissue, which Paul mentioned, for example, due to weight loss. One reason why I stay fat. Could continue to damage a man's developing sperm. That's what I always thought. It's our sperm that's creating the problem in the child, and thus interfere with conception and conceptuses. In any case, any exposure of the father that could affect his children must occur before their conception. That's what we've been saying. Your sperm or your whatever produces that is altered. And it doesn't maybe change your DNA, but it alters. And from what I've read of the Agent Orange Commission's work, and again, I have no idea where it is in your DNA sequence, an AH receptor is what dioxin attaches itself to and alters it.
This gets real technical, okay, because sequencing has to do with, there are 4 basic amino acids. Okay, there's no more, no less. Every carbon-based organism on the face of this planet uses those same 4 bases, adenine, guanine, da-da-da, okay, and the 2 others. It does not change that alteration of those connections, because adenine can only hook up with something, guanine can only hook up with, okay? But it can affect the result of those connections. Does that make sense to everybody? So we're not talking about the micromolecule, but we're talking about the result of those micromolecules together, which is the DNA.
One person has asked, I heard several dates for the start of spraying of Agent Orange. What is a valid date of spraying in South Vietnam, and dates spraying anywhere else in the world? That's kind of a general question. And why don't we tie that together with how many sites worldwide has DOD finally identified as Agent Orange sites? Anybody?
I'll answer the last piece first. The numbers are still coming in, believe it or not. I just was looking at some data the other day where there were approximately 800 drums shipped to the Panama Canal Zone, where they were supposed to have been stored for future use. Those 800 drums have disappeared. The supposition is that they ultimately found their way to the country of Colombia, because there was talk in the Reagan administration of using Agent Orange to defoliate the cocaine. In terms of the use of Agent Orange, let's talk about how Agent Orange got started. Agent Orange, the formulation for Agent Orange was invented in 1922. It was tested in a national forest that is bounded by the states of Connecticut and New York. To this day, that area in those 2 states is off limits. In 1939, the formula for that chemical was sold to Monsanto Chemical Company for $250,000. $250,000 in 1939, 1940 was a hell of a lot of money. So Monsanto became the first owner of the trademarked chemical. And they fooled around with it, and they gave some of it to Allied and some of it to Dow. And ultimately, there were 7 chemical companies, U.S. chemical companies, who were doing different things with this formulation. At the same time, at the end of World War II, the military thinkers in the Pentagon were looking at where is our next war going to be, and the idea came that we're probably going to be heavily involved in the Pacific Rim. Well, the Pacific Rim is full of countries that have triple canopy jungle. And so surreptitiously, that's on the sneak, I like to use big words every once in a while, even though I'm a Marine.
He's from New Jersey.
Yeah, that doesn't count. The Department of Defense put out a feeler within the chemical industry to see who could produce a chemical that would defoliate the jungle. And they got proposals back from these 7 chemical companies. And so they began to work out the process of manufacture against the day they were going to need this stuff. In 1953, there was a meeting in Midland, Michigan that was called by Dow to talk about where the industry was at that point. And the early R&D with that particular chemical already gave the chemical industry the understanding that in lab animals, particularly rats, that there were problems not only in producing offspring, but the offspring living. So in 1953, they already knew that. In about 1957, DOD began to award the first of the contracts. Now, Vietnam is not on anybody's radar. I mean, we don't even have 400 advisors in country at that point. The Eisenhower administration is looking at what they're going to do in the aftermath of Dien Bien Phu in 1954, with the realization that we're probably going to wind up having a substantial number of advisors in there within the next couple of years. So the chemical industry starts gearing up. Then we get in there and we find out that we got a bigger problem than we thought. And the chemical industries were told, you need to get X number of thousands of gallons of this stuff ready to be shipped to Vietnam. That's how we got the potency out of the chemical. The chemical was actually tested at Eglin Air Force Base in Florida in 1956, 1957, and 1958. It was also tested in the El Yunque, which is the rainforest in Puerto Rico. And for you Marines who have ever been to Roosevelt Roads, it's right down the street. It was also tested in other different climates, notably Fort Drum, New York, and at the Dugway Proving Grounds in Utah. The initial test runs, if you will, were something called Operation Farmgate, which began in December of 1960 into February of 1961. Operation Farmgate then became Operation Ranch Hand and began full-bore spraying by fixed-wing aircraft, notably C-123Ks, in August of 1961. Now, we don't really have combat troops in Vietnam until 1965. So what's the big deal? 4 years before the first combat troops are introduced, we've already got 4 years' worth of spray. The stuff doesn't go anywhere. It's in the water, it's in the soil, it's in the limestone formations, it's everywhere. We introduced ground troops. I went ashore March 8, 1965, from Okinawa, aboard ship. And we went out and we did our thing. Never knew a doggone thing about spraying. And the spraying continued until January the 10th of 1971, which was 2 days after the World Health Organization banned 2,4,5-T, which then subsequently stopped the production of herbicides. So that's a long answer, but that's the answer.
And to continue on answering that question, there were other sites, as we mentioned before, that were exposed. If you want to look those up, there is an organization called the Lehigh Valley Military Affairs Council. I know some of you are familiar with it. If you go to its blog site, that is lvmac.wordpress.com, and on the right-hand side, you'll see a section called Answers Desk, and go to hazardous exposures, and then go down to the era of Vietnam. It will actually lead you to all the sites that have been involved.
Rich?
Yes.
One other comment.
LVMAC, Lima, Victor, Mike, Alpha, Charlie, it's been a long time, .wordpress.com, all right? And then on the right-hand side, Answers Desk, and go on down further, you'll see hazardous exposures, and that'll lead you through. There's a table of contents. You can get to it from their website as well, okay? If you go down, Info for You, Answers Desk.
One other agency that we never talk about, okay, because we're veterans, right? We focus on DOD, is the U.S. Forest Service. They used it in a number of places around the country, too.
Yeah. Next question. Eventually, we're going to get to this issue of what you can do to help us, okay? That's that legislation that has been mentioned a couple times. One of the important points of the Toxic Exposure Research Act is it's not just for Vietnam veterans. It's also for the current generation of warriors. So this question, do you know if any chemicals have been secretly used in Afghanistan? The reason this person is asking is her son's son, that is her grandson, has spina bifida, and as you know, with Agent Orange, spina bifida is one of the recognized ones, or at least from Vietnam, spina bifida is one of the recognized maladies.
Well, I don't know about secretly, but the fact of the matter is that at least during the first Gulf War, when we sent in our special ops people, not necessarily all special ops people, but our Rangers and airborne and stuff, to take out Saddam's chemical weapons storage dumps, okay, they neglected to account for wind drift. And so we have huge units in the United States Army that were downwind and they were not in chemical gear. And we are seeing not only the soldiers themselves, but their kids turning up with ALS, MLS, those related neurological diseases that we believe is related to the exposure to those chemical and ammo dumps during the first Gulf War. During the current wars, in the big sandbox and in Afghanistan, of course, it's the burn pits. Now, there are some burn pits that they've been able to determine as a result of burning. They burned everything, or they're still burning it, even though we built 4 chemical plants over there, incinerators. We are still burning pits. We still have burn pits. I've actually attended a meeting where they tried to put together some information about one of the burn pits at one of the large bases over there. They actually found a tank at the bottom of this burn pit that was all, I believe it was just slightly less than 1 kilometer wide, okay? But tank that had been hit by depleted uranium, and so been buried in this stuff. Plus all the plastic, all the human waste, everything went into these burn pits, all right? And there are people coming down with severe respiratory disorders, people who normally ran marathons and that kind of thing, and all of a sudden, one of the associated diseases with that is you have these little things in your lungs called alveoli, and that's these tiny, tiny little things, and that's where the oxygen and the blood, or the oxygen is exchanged into the blood. All right, well, exposure to not only the burn pits, but the dust is so fine in Afghanistan that it causes these little alveoli to essentially become concrete-like. All right? So we're going to see a lot of respiratory-related kinds of diseases in the newest crop of veterans, meaning the ones over the last 13 years, never mind the ones from 90 and 91.
Thank you. Next question, I'm going to combine two different diseases or conditions. Has anything shown that Agent Orange and infertility are related in men, okay, or even women who served over there, I'll add, okay? And is Agent Orange in some way associated with hepatitis C? And I'll modify that to say the conditions that are kind of related to hepatitis C.
Mike answered the first part of the question earlier. If you consider damaged sperm as part of the infertility problem, then yes. I mean, that only makes sense. As far as Hep C and exposure to Agent Orange, no. Hep C is a virus that, as a matter of fact, wasn't discovered until the late 1940s. When it was found, it was called non-Hep A and non-Hep B. Finally, they did whatever they did to give it its official designation. But in any case, it's shown to be not as the result of exposure to pesticides or insecticides, but rather things such as intravenous drug use, dirty needles. There's a small risk of you getting it sexually if one or both partners in the sexual act have open or small cuts or abrasions, transfer of bodily fluids, as we call it. So it's not related to exposure to pesticides or herbicides, but that's another thing that you need to be aware of, because the primary mode of transmission for Hep C is exposure to bodily fluids, which includes blood and other bodily fluids. And for those of us who are medics or corpsmen, it's particularly high risk. And actually, when you compare Vietnam veterans to the rest of the population, and you account for age and gender, we are at the highest risk for Hep C, and that's why we've mounted a national campaign to get tested. But you're going to be asked questions about your sex life, whether you ever used any drugs intravenously. You're going to be asked a lot of questions that you don't want to be asked, but the only way to get to the root of this is to ask those questions. I don't believe that some of them are actually really add anything to it, but at this point, I don't serve on any of those committees that make up those questionnaires.
Okay. And then this one relates to the children, and I think Mike and Paul have actually answered this one before. Is there a connection? And because no studies have been done, we can't say really one way or the other. Is Agent Orange been linked to autism?
As far as I know, it hasn't been linked to autism. But from what I know of what my daughter has found out is that her two boys, my two grandchildren, even though they are not on the autism, well, they are on the spectrum, but it's 0. So it's not, the disorders they have is not, quote, autism. It's, yes, it's on the spectrum, but it's at 0%.
A year ago, there's a group that deals with adding, taking away, expanding definitions of mental health related diseases. It's called the Diagnostic and Statistic Manual. And there was a new one that came out, okay, a year ago, DSM-5. In the DSM-5, amongst other things, they moved PTSD from anxiety disorders to its own separate section, and that's good. On the other hand, what they did with autism is expanded, all right, the diagnoses, the treatments, the causes, all this kind of thing. And so I would only add to what Mike says is there hasn't been enough research done to show any possible links. So the number that Michael said, it's 0 on the autism spectrum, because that's what they call it when it's a range of illnesses. Some of you know or may have children with very severe autism. Some people have children who have only a couple of things associated with the diagnosis. So that's what he's talking about, the spectrum. And that became part of DSM-5. And my argument is that they need more research.
Okay. I'll preface this question. Agent Orange is composed of several compounds, chief among them 2,4-D and 2,4,5-T. They were both used in farming as early as the 40s. 2,4,5-T in 1970, they took it off the market due to its known toxicity, or the suspected toxicity at that time. But 2,4-D is being continued to be used. It's an old standby. It's probably the 5th most used herbicide in farming. Why this renewed interest in 2,4-D? Many of us have heard that as a result of GMO, that this is going to skyrocket. Why this renewed interest in 2,4-D? You want to answer that one, Kelly?
Sure. The interest isn't, like one thing I want to make clear is that the interest isn't just agricultural.
Okay.
As I said before with like Scott's Turf Builder, and they're not the only ones, but that just happens to be the one that's sticking in my brain right now. But it's also being used in lawn care. So to kind of, it's crafty the way that this is being done, because a lot of the publicized concerns are focusing our attention on the farms, which are usually not near us. Okay, so if you're like myself, that I live in the city of Bethlehem, the nearest farm is like 6 miles away from me. So it's not constantly on my radar, but what is not being said is the increased use of 2,4-D in lawn care. But to answer the question specifically, why is there an increase in the amount of 2,4-D in agriculture? Is it because of GMOs? Maybe. But I think mostly it's just because like our policies, the legislation that has led to those policies has just become more complicated. There's more loopholes that work in favor of these chemical companies, and they're writing these policies. Monsanto is, they're at the table when we're coming up with these things. So the regulations are far more relaxed than they have been in the past. So again, they're just they're allowed to essentially do as they want until it's proven that it's a health hazard. And usually by that time, it's too late. But that's kind of like why I see the increase in use.
Okay.
Another thing, okay, let's go to the other end of the crop continuum, the very start, okay? And we've all heard the term, VVA uses the term, that's the letter we wrote, okay, to the president. We called it Frankencorn. Now, there's a soil-living bacterium that makes an insecticide, a natural insecticide. The insecticide itself is a protein. One way to use it is to grow the bacteria and spread it onto crops. Okay, it works, and it's not as harmful, as far as we know, because it degrades in sunlight. And as long as what's left is washed off before eating, there's not a problem. So lots of organic farmers use this in terms of their marketing strategy. However, Monsanto took the gene for the BT program, protein, Bacillus thuringiensis, if you're interested in scientific names, the BT protein, and transferred it into the corn. The plants made the protein in every cell, and thus corn worm borers were stymied, okay? So, in the meantime, however, since this started, a lot of BT corn has been sold, but we're not told that we're eating an insecticide, are we? All right, so one of the things that was predicted was that, as expected, the corn rootworm would be growing or would eventually grow resistant to BT corn, so other insecticides have to be used in increasing quantities. Okay, Wall Street noticed this too. So stocks in those companies, you know, have gone up. But anyway, it means that resistant bugs can attack corn crops, so their natural BT insecticidal bacteria become ineffective. So we use more of the organic phosphates, for example, insecticides. So you tie that in with what Kelly just said, there's a story right there. It's a continuum.
Okay. We mentioned GMO products. One of the questions that was asked, I think we talked about strawberries and corn, but what crops predominantly are now being grown that involve GMO?
There's several GMO crops that the USDA has said it's okay to grow them. I think the last number I saw was something like 86 varieties of edibles and non-edibles. But commercially, I believe there's only 5 that are used. There's corn, soy, alfalfa, papaya, and then the one non-edible is corn. It's not corn, cotton. So those are the ones that we see the most. But the real big one that is out there is corn. And something that we need to be aware of is that this corn just keeps the need for it seems to increase every single year as they find new ways to use it. So I'm sure that many of you who have gone to the pumps, you see that 10% of the fuel that you're putting into your car is with ethanol. That's with GMO corn. So when you fill up your car, you're actually kind of putting money into this whole schism.
Now, what Kelly is talking about is the BT crops, okay? The one I just went through the whole technical. So I said when I got up there, or stood up there, if you've been eating strawberries grown in this country in January, those are genetically modified strawberries, but they are not BT products. They were genetically modified against cold temperatures. It's a different gene altogether, all right? And there's some work going on with potatoes, all right, and apples. Because as the climate extremes get worse, okay, our crops are reacting to those changes. But those are not the BT GMOs, which is, you know, you got to differentiate between those. And that's why I said there's some good GMOs, there's some bad GMOs.
One of the questions that was asked, and Paul just alluded to it, was what is dioxin? And let me ask the question this way. Is it the dioxin, or since 2,4,5-T is no longer being used, is it the 2,4-D that we should be worried about? Is one worse than the other? What do they do respectively?
Well, dioxin is dioxin. As I said, there are a couple of hundred different varieties. You can actually create dioxin by lighting a campfire. Right. The dioxin that we're concerned about, 2378-TCDD, is found only in this one chemical. It's a result. It's as a result of the marriage of 2,4-D and 2,4,5-T. 2,4-D by itself has a form of dioxin that is extremely poisonous. As an example, there have been hundreds of reports of animals who roll on the lawn becoming sick from a variety of skin-related diseases and, in a lot of cases, cancers that are unique to dogs. It also creates a susceptibility, is another word, in small children. The dioxin in 2,4,5-T was known for a long time to be extremely poisonous by itself, but until other countries actually put their 2 cents in, there was nothing ever done about banning 2,4,5-T until 1970 and 71 when they stopped worldwide production. The particular dioxin that was contained in Agent Orange is only found in that one chemical. And it's been the source of our aggravation and argument and advocacy, for me, for 44 years. We no longer create 2378-TCDD. There's 1.5 million gallons of it sitting out there on Johnson Atoll in the middle of Pacific Ocean. There's a rumored 800 and some barrels of this stuff sitting on the tundra at Fort Richardson, Alaska. And there are other barrels here, there, and everywhere. So we haven't completely eradicated it. What our concern is, what this crap did when it was sprayed on the landscape in Vietnam, and we came in contact with it. And that's always been the source of our argument. No dioxin is good. In extreme quantities, it's extremely poisonous, as an example of what happened to us.
As I said earlier, the important thing when you talk to the Congress people, now let me stop there for a minute. Chances are, okay, you're going to be directed to an aide. You're going to be directed to an aide. But those people report to the Congress people, all right? So as part of your call, you need to mention this is no new funding is required, as I said earlier. All right? It's just moving around the current VA research funds for research into this area or into these areas. So, the point being that no matter what I do in Washington, D.C., it's much more effective, okay, if Menendez gets 20 calls from you people in his district than one meeting with Tom Berger, okay? Because you vote for him or not. Okay, I guess he's under a little pressure right now. But in any case, okay, Tom doesn't vote for him. My representatives are Mikulski and other people. All right? So, and last but not least, I'll give you the 3 principles, okay, of advocacy. Follow up, follow up, follow up. All right? As Rich said, people will say, well, he or she, meaning Congress people, they think they'll support it, da-da-da. You want a commitment from them that they will support it. And you follow up saying, I talked to whoever a week ago, and you said this. Is this still going to happen? And then you follow up a week later. Okay? You got to nail their hides to the wall. So follow up, follow up, follow up. And remember, okay, no new funds added for this, regardless of what BS the aide or the congressperson gives you. No new funds.
An important part of this, as was mentioned, this is not just an Agent Orange bill. This is also looking out for our brothers and those who have followed after us, the soldiers, sailors, and Marines, and even Air Force, okay, and Coast Guard. You know, Coast Guard does a lot more than a lot of you might think. Now, the guy who starred this all, if it weren't for him, starred, you know, the seed of a thought in a brain, and that was the brain of Mike Regrut, the chairman of the Veterans Affairs Committee, the Agent Orange Committee for VVA 415. I'd like to bring him up to bring this to an end. If you would, Mike.
Thank you so much, folks. You've had an opportunity to sit here for a few hours today, and I know it all meant a lot to you, or else you wouldn't have been here. But there's one thing I want you to do today, if not today, tomorrow. Take action, as these speakers have told you. Get involved. Call your senators, call your congressmen, tell them what we want to happen. And not only in House Resolution 1769/Senate 901, but also bear in mind the Agent Orange Act of 1991 will expire on the 30th of this month. There is a bill in the House 3423, which will extend that original act for 2 more years to the year 2017. It is imperative that you contact your congressman to tell them to extend this bill for another 2 more years. Without it, the Institute of Medicine will not have to provide any information to the VA any longer, because that is what the VA uses when they make their decisions in regards to issues with Agent Orange. If that bill dies, we're going to lose
all the protection that the veterans need and their families. So contact them, tell them you want their support on 3423, as well as 1769/901. And you might also remember the Blue Water Navy guys who have not been included in the Agent Orange program. There's a bill 969 in the House to give those guys protection under the Agent Orange policy. They felt that they're too far out at sea, they weren't exposed to it. But believe me, it didn't matter where you were. Anywhere over there in the Pacific, you were exposed to Agent Orange. But if anything, get involved. Read the labels on things that you buy every day without giving it any thought. Take the safety precautions that you should be taking that you don't normally take. Whether you're buying an herbicide or a pesticide, you got to remember that word "side" means kill. If it's going to kill weeds, if it's going to kill insects, it's going to kill you. So get active and start reading labels and start making contact with your elected officials. I'd like to conclude by saying thank you all for being here today. God bless you all, and you have a safe trip going home. But also, I'd love to thank my committee who made it possible to have this event today. Without their help, I could have never done this by myself.
Let's give them a round of applause, please.
To continue on that thought line, I want to also thank all my fellow 415 members who volunteered today, as well as the AVVA members who helped out to get this thing underway. I also want to thank Northampton Community College for providing us this venue. Without their help, and through the Band of Brothers here at the college, the involvement that they have provided, you know, it's just hats off to those folks. God bless you all. Safe trip home.